Lauren and her husband were just trying to get home when everything changed in an instant. What started as a simple evening turned into a shocking encounter they never expected. Stay with us to the end. You won't believe what happened. If you stand against injustice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Lauren was on her way home after a long day at work, feeling the weight of exhaustion tugging at her every step. As the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting a dim, warm glow over the streets, she decided to take a shortcut through a quieter part of town. This area wasn't particularly well lit, and it was undergoing some road maintenance, but she'd taken this path before and felt it would help her get home faster. Her husband, the state governor, was waiting for her, and she was looking forward to finally winding down and sharing a quiet evening with him. Lauren was a woman of resilience, having faced her share of challenges as a black woman navigating the world. Despite this, she carried herself with an air of quiet strength and poise, unshaken by the looks or whispers that sometimes followed her. Tonight, however, she was focused on nothing more than reaching home, unaware that the peace of her journey was about to be shattered in an instant. As she passed by the local fire station, she noticed a group of firefighters finishing what looked like an evening training drill. They were gathered around a fire truck, laughing and joking among themselves. Normally, she wouldn't have given it much thought, but as she walked by, she caught a few of them looking in her direction. She hoped it was just a passing glance, yet the look in their eyes held something unsettling, a mixture of arrogance and contempt. She felt a tightening in her chest as one of the firefighters, a tall man with a rough demeanor, detached himself from the group and stepped into her path. Lauren instinctively slowed her pace, her polite smile fading as she tried to assess the situation. "Hey there," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You look like you're a little lost. This isn't really the best place for a lady like you to be wandering around at night." Lauren maintained her composure, offering a curt nod. "Thank you, but I'm not lost, just heading home." The man chuckled, glancing back at his friends, who were now watching with amused expressions. "Is that so? Well, it seems like you could use a little help finding your way." Before she could respond, two more firefighters joined him, effectively blocking her path. Lauren felt a surge of unease, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I appreciate the concern," she said, her voice steady, "but I know where I'm going." Another firefighter, a younger man with a mocking grin, sneered, "Are you sure? You look pretty out of place here. Maybe we should give you a hand." He leaned in closer, his gaze turning from curious to invasive. Lauren took a small step back, her heart rate increasing. She wasn't afraid of standing her ground, but she recognized the volatile energy around her. These men were used to authority, used to the respect that came with their uniforms. In this moment, however, it seemed like they were using that authority for something much darker. She knew she had to handle this carefully. "I don't want any trouble," she said, keeping her tone firm but polite. "Just let me pass and I'll be on my way." Her words, however, seemed to amuse them even more. One of them laughed, the sound cold and dismissive. "Trouble? Oh, we're just trying to be friendly," he said, exchanging a glance with the others. They edged closer, their casual stances masking an undercurrent of hostility. Lauren clenched her fists, feeling trapped. It was clear they had no intention of letting her walk away easily. One of the men reached out as if to grab her arm, but she stepped back, her voice rising just enough to assert herself. "Please, back off. I don't want to have to call for help." This statement seemed to provoke them further. The firefighter who had spoken first narrowed his eyes, his expression shifting to one of clear irritation. "Help?" he scoffed. "Who do you think is going to help you here?" As he spoke, he picked up a heavy fire hose lying nearby. The others watched with interest, as if eager to see what he would do next. Lauren's pulse quickened as she realized his intention. He slowly uncoiled the hose, glancing back at his friends, who laughed approvingly. The man lifted the hose and pointed it in her direction, his grin widening. Lauren took a step back, alarm flashing in her eyes. "What are you doing? This isn't funny." "Relax," he sneered. "It's just a little water." And with that, he released a powerful jet of cold water straight at her. The force of the water struck her with such intensity that she staggered back, barely keeping her balance. The freezing blast drenched her from head to toe, sending a shock through her entire body. She gasped, struggling to shield herself from the relentless spray, but the firefighter showed no signs of stopping. The others cheered him on, their laughter ringing in her ears as the water continued to pummel her. Lauren felt herself being pushed back by the sheer pressure of the hose, her feet slipping on the wet pavement. She fought to maintain her footing, but the force was too much. Within seconds, she lost her balance and fell hard onto the ground, the impact jolting her body. The icy water continued to pour over her, pinning her down as she tried to shield her face with her arms. Humiliation washed over her, mingling with the physical pain. She could barely hear her own thoughts over the roar of the water and the laughter of the men who found amusement in her suffering. The intensity of the spray left her gasping for breath, her body trembling from the cold and the force of the water. Despite her best efforts to shield herself, she was completely soaked, every inch of her clothing clinging to her skin. "Stop! Please, stop!" she shouted, her voice breaking as she struggled to be heard over the sound of the hose. But her pleas only seemed to fuel their enjoyment. They showed no sign of stopping, reveling in her helplessness. For a moment, she felt a wave of helplessness crash over her. She had faced many challenges in her life, but nothing quite like this. It wasn't just the physical attack, it was the callous disregard, the utter lack of humanity in their eyes that cut her to the core. As she lay there, struggling to find some way to escape, a glimmer of hope flickered in her heart. She knew that she couldn't let them win, couldn't let them strip her of her dignity. If she could just hold on a little longer, she hoped that someone might come, someone who would help her put an end to this nightmare. And as she closed her eyes against the torrent, she silently prayed that her suffering wouldn't go unanswered. Lauren lay on the cold, hard pavement, gasping for air, drenched and humiliated. The firefighters' laughter echoed around her, loud and harsh, amplifying her sense of helplessness. Her clothes clung to her skin, soaked through by the powerful stream of water that had relentlessly forced her down. Her mind raced, searching for a way to escape, but every movement seemed only to amuse the men even more. "Look at her," one of the firefighters sneered, his tone filled with mockery. "Trying to crawl away like a drowned rat." Lauren forced herself to her feet, ignoring the sting of scrapes on her knees and palms. She looked up at the group, her gaze steady, though her heart was pounding. "I just want to leave," she said, her voice low but resolute. "Let me pass." Her words, instead of evoking any sympathy, seemed only to embolden the men. The firefighter who had initially blocked her path stepped forward, eyeing her with a twisted grin. He gestured to the hose which still lay in his hands, dripping water onto the ground. "Leave?" he repeated mockingly. "We're just getting started here." Lauren took a step back, keeping her eyes on them, trying to gauge how serious they were. One part of her wanted to run, to find a way out of this nightmare, but another part, the stronger part, told her that fleeing would only give them the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. She squared her shoulders, determined not to give them that power. Seeing her resolve, the firefighter's grin faded into something more menacing. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he spat. "Well, let's see just how tough you really are." Without warning, he turned the hose back on, unleashing another forceful jet of water. Lauren tried to brace herself, but the pressure was too strong. She was knocked backward, her feet slipping as the cold water pummeled her once more. The impact sent her sprawling onto the wet ground, her hands scraping against the rough pavement. "Stop it!" she yelled, her voice barely audible over the roaring water. "Please, I just want to go home." But her pleas went unheard, drowned out by the mocking jeers and laughter of the firefighters. Another one of them, a younger man with a mocking smirk, stepped closer, leaning down to sneer at her. "What's wrong? Can't handle a little water?" Lauren's pulse quickened as she looked up at him, fighting the instinct to strike back. She could feel the frustration and anger building within her, but she knew that any retaliation would only worsen her situation. The men around her had the power in this moment, and they were reveling in it. "Just let me leave," she said, her voice steadier this time. "There's no need for this." "Oh, but there is," the first firefighter said, an edge of cruelty in his voice. "We need to teach you a lesson, lady, walking around here like you own the place." Lauren's brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm just walking home," she said. "What harm am I doing to any of you?" Her question, meant to appeal to their reason, only seemed to fuel their hostility. The younger firefighter sneered again, nudging his friend as he spoke. "She doesn't get it, does she? Some people just don't know their place." Lauren felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold water soaking her clothes. There was something sinister in his words, something that made her stomach turn. She knew that this was about more than just a random act of cruelty. It was about power, control, and their need to assert dominance over her. Without warning, the firefighter tightened his grip on the hose, sending another powerful jet of water straight at her. The force of it struck her square in the chest, knocking the wind out of her and forcing her backward. She stumbled, her vision blurring as she struggled to stay on her feet. "Had enough?" he taunted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Lauren fought to catch her breath, clutching her arms around herself in an attempt to shield her body from the relentless assault. "Please," she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips, but there was no mercy in their eyes, no sign that they would stop. She was their entertainment, a figure of ridicule that they could torment at will. Her pleas only seemed to amuse them, to give them a sick thrill as they continued their cruel game. One of the other firefighters, watching from a few steps back, crossed his arms and smirked. "Maybe she'll think twice before walking around here again, thinking she's better than the rest of us." The words cut through Lauren like a knife. She wasn't trying to prove anything, wasn't trying to challenge anyone. All she wanted was to get home, to see her husband and leave this horrifying experience behind her. But she was trapped, surrounded by men who took pleasure in her suffering, men who seemed to see her very existence as an affront. As she struggled to stand, the firefighter with the hose approached her, the cruel glint in his eyes more pronounced than ever. "One more time, sweetheart," he sneered, raising the hose as if preparing to strike her down with another blast of water. Lauren's heart raced, a mixture of fear and defiance swelling within her. She knew she couldn't endure much more of this, but she also knew that she couldn't let them see her break. She held her ground, meeting his gaze with a steady resolve, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. But, as he prepared to unleash another torrent, a voice broke through the air, sharp and commanding. "That's enough." The firefighters paused, turning to see a tall man striding toward them, his eyes blazing with anger. Lauren felt a surge of relief as she recognized him, her husband. He had found her, had come to her aid just when she needed him most. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his tone cold and authoritative. "Step away from her now." The firefighters exchanged glances, their smug expressions faltering. One of them, the man holding the hose, scoffed, eyeing him with disdain. "Who are you to tell us what to do?" he sneered. "This doesn't concern you." Lauren's husband stepped forward, his gaze unyielding. "It does concern me," he said. "That's my wife you're assaulting, and I'm telling you to back off." The firefighters looked at each other, seemingly unimpressed. One of them chuckled, shaking his head. "Your wife? And who exactly are you supposed to be?" Lauren's husband met his gaze, his voice steady. "I'm the governor of this state, and I demand you stop this immediately." The declaration hung in the air, a momentary silence settling over the group. The firefighters exchanged glances, their disbelief evident. Then the man with the hose burst into laughter, the sound harsh and mocking. "Governor?" he scoffed. "A black man, governor? Nice try, buddy, but we're not falling for that." Lauren's husband clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "I'm not asking," he said, his tone deadly serious. "Stand down or face the consequences." But the firefighters only laughed harder, their expressions turning even more contemptuous. "Oh, we'll show you consequences," one of them sneered. "Think you can just walk up here and boss us around?" With that, he turned the hose toward Lauren's husband, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. Before he could react, a powerful blast of water hit him square in the chest, sending him staggering backward. Lauren cried out, her heart sinking as she watched her husband struggle against the relentless stream of water. He tried to steady himself, but the force was too much, knocking him down beside her. The firefighters laughed, their taunts ringing out as they reveled in their cruelty. "Didn't anyone teach you not to lie?" one of them jeered, aiming the hose at him once more. "Guess we'll have to teach you a lesson too." Lauren's husband tried to shield himself, his body soaked and shivering from the cold, but the firefighters showed no mercy. They took turns aiming the hose at him, each blast of water more brutal than the last. Lauren watched in horror, helpless to intervene, her heart breaking as she saw him subjected to the same humiliation she had endured. The assault seemed to go on forever, each second stretching out in unbearable agony. Finally, one of the firefighters stepped forward, lowering the hose with a smirk. "Let that be a lesson to both of you," he said, his voice filled with derision. "Know your place." As they turned away, leaving Lauren and her husband drenched and beaten on the ground, Lauren felt a surge of defiance rise within her. She knew that this moment would not be forgotten, that justice would be served for what they had endured. And as she met her husband's gaze, a silent vow passed between them, a promise that they would not rest until these men were held accountable. Lauren shivered on the cold, wet pavement, her body aching and clothes clinging to her skin. Her husband lay beside her, equally soaked and shivering from the onslaught they had endured. She glanced at him, a deep sadness filling her heart at the sight of his usually strong and dignified figure, now slumped and drenched, reduced by the cruelty of men who refused to see them as anything but targets for their twisted amusement. The firefighters, however, were far from finished. As Lauren and her husband tried to compose themselves, the group of men exchanged glances, smirking as they moved back toward them. The ringleader, the one who had first picked up the hose, loomed over them with a cruel grin, the fire hose still in his grip. "What's the matter?" he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Governor's feeling a bit under the weather?" Lauren's husband straightened slightly, though every movement seemed to cost him. He looked up at the man with defiant eyes. "This will have consequences," he said, his tone calm yet filled with a warning. "You're digging your own graves." But the firefighters only laughed, their derision intensifying. "Consequences?" one of them repeated, his tone a sneering echo. "You really think anyone's going to care about a couple of liars?" Lauren clenched her fists, feeling the anger rise within her, but she forced herself to remain silent. They had already seen what these men were capable of. Provoking them further could make the situation even worse. The lead firefighter nudged the others, his grin widening. "Look at them," he sneered, "all high and mighty, thinking they're something special. Well, guess what? Around here, you're nobody." With that, he pointed the hose back at Lauren and her husband, his finger hovering over the nozzle. Lauren felt her heart skip a beat as she saw the cold gleam of malice in his eyes. She knew he wouldn't hesitate to blast them again, and she braced herself, hoping to withstand whatever they threw at her. Without warning, the powerful stream of water surged toward them again, striking both Lauren and her husband with relentless force. The freezing cold hit her like a wall, driving the breath from her lungs as she struggled to shield herself. She could feel the sting of the water against her skin, a sharp, punishing force that left her gasping. Beside her, her husband tried to hold his ground, but the pressure of the water knocked him back, sending him sprawling onto the wet pavement. He groaned, trying to rise, but another blast forced him down again, and he fell hard onto his side. The firefighters laughed, their voices filled with a twisted delight as they watched the two struggle against the relentless spray. Lauren's vision blurred from the cold and the force of the water, but she could still see the cruel satisfaction in their expressions, the joy they took in her suffering. "Is that all you got, Governor?" one of them taunted, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Where's that big talk now?" Lauren gritted her teeth, fighting the urge to respond. She knew any protest would only fuel their enjoyment. Instead, she focused on enduring, on withstanding the unrelenting humiliation and cruelty they inflicted upon her and her husband. She told herself that it would end, that someone would come to stop this madness. But with each second that passed, her hope began to fade. As the blast continued, one of the firefighters stepped closer, a look of disdain on his face. "You two should have known better than to come around here acting like you're something special," he spat. "You're nothing. Just a couple of nobodies who need to be put in their place." Lauren's husband, despite the agony he was enduring, managed to lift his head, his gaze steady. "You may think that now," he said, his voice weak but defiant. "But trust me, this will be the biggest mistake of your lives." The firefighter snorted, unimpressed. "We'll see about that." He turned the hose on him again, sending another powerful jet of water that forced him back down, his body slamming against the pavement with a painful thud. Lauren cried out, reaching for him, but the water struck her too, pinning her to the ground. She felt as though she were drowning, the cold seeping into her bones, the relentless pressure of the water crushing her spirit. She wanted to fight back, to resist, but the exhaustion and pain left her helpless. Finally, the lead firefighter signaled to the others to ease off. The stream of water slowed, then stopped, leaving Lauren and her husband lying in a pool of cold, muddy water. She shivered uncontrollably, her body racked with tremors as she tried to catch her breath. The firefighters stepped back, their expressions smug and satisfied. "Maybe now you'll think twice before showing your faces around here," one of them sneered. "Consider it a lesson in humility." Lauren's husband struggled to sit up, his face a mixture of pain and defiance. He looked at them, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and fierce. "You'll regret this." But the men only laughed, clearly unafraid. One of them leaned down, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Go ahead, Governor. Tell whoever you want. No one's going to believe a word you say." With that, they turned and walked away, leaving Lauren and her husband lying in the cold and the wet, battered and humiliated. Lauren felt a surge of despair as she watched them go, knowing that they would continue their lives without a second thought, while she and her husband were left to deal with the scars of this horrific experience. She turned to her husband, reaching out to help him sit up. His face was pale, his clothes soaked and torn, but his eyes still held a spark of determination. "We'll make them pay for this," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet resolve. Lauren nodded, her own determination hardening. She knew that they couldn't let this go unpunished. They had to stand up not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever suffered at the hands of people like these. They would fight, and they would make sure that justice was served. But even as she made this silent vow, a part of her wondered if anyone would listen, if anyone would care. They were up against a system that had protected men like these firefighters for far too long. Still, she clung to hope, knowing that they had to try. As they rose, helping each other to their feet, a small crowd had begun to gather nearby. People whispered among themselves, their faces filled with shock and sympathy. One woman approached them cautiously, a concerned expression on her face. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine worry. Lauren managed a weak nod. "We'll be fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. The woman looked at them, her eyes narrowing as she took in their soaked and battered appearance. "What happened?" she pressed, glancing in the direction the firefighters had gone. Lauren hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. But her husband spoke up, his voice steady. "We were attacked," he said simply, "and we intend to make sure they're held accountable." The woman nodded, her expression turning grim. "I saw some of it from across the street," she said. "I have friends who will want to know about this. Don't worry, you're not alone." Her words brought a small measure of comfort to Lauren, a reminder that they were not as isolated as they had felt in that terrible moment. There were people who cared, people who would stand with them. As they began to walk away, still shivering from the cold, Lauren felt a renewed sense of purpose. They would not let this cruelty go unanswered. Together, they would stand up, they would fight, and they would seek justice. This was only the beginning. As Lauren and her husband continued their unsteady walk, every step felt like an insurmountable struggle. They moved through the streets, their clothes still soaked, bodies battered, but their minds sharpened with a sense of purpose. Lauren held onto her husband's arm, feeling the weight of exhaustion and pain, but his presence beside her was a source of strength. They knew they couldn't let the firefighters' cruelty go unchallenged. The injustice was too severe, the humiliation too deep. As they reached the main street, more people began to notice them, whispering to one another, some glancing with sympathetic, others with confused expressions. The firefighters' actions had been brutal and unprovoked, yet the strength of her husband's grip reminded her that this fight wasn't over. But they hadn't expected to confront their attackers again so soon. Just as they were passing a side street, a group of firefighters turned the corner, laughing loudly, their voices echoing through the night air. It took a moment for Lauren to recognize them, but as soon as she did, a shiver ran down her spine. It was the same group, the same men who had humiliated them. Her husband stiffened beside her, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of them. The lead firefighter, the man who had first pointed the hose at them, noticed them and stopped, his laughter cutting off as a smug smile crept across his face. He nudged one of his companions, whispering something that made them all chuckle. "Well, well," he sneered, stepping forward. "Look who's back for more." Lauren's husband took a step forward, his jaw clenched tightly. "Enough," he said, his voice a low, controlled warning. "Your behavior is unacceptable, and you will face the consequences for what you've done." The firefighter raised an eyebrow, his smirk growing wider. "Consequences?" he mocked, looking back at his friends for encouragement. "You think you're going to give us consequences?" "Yes," Lauren's husband replied firmly. "I will see to it that each of you is held accountable for this." The men laughed, clearly unconcerned. The lead firefighter shook his head, taking a few casual steps closer. "You really think you have that kind of power?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Who are you supposed to be, anyway?" "I am the governor of this state," Lauren's husband stated clearly, his voice filled with conviction. "And I won't allow anyone, least of all men like you, to abuse their authority." The laughter stopped abruptly. The men looked at each other, their faces a mix of disbelief and irritation. The lead firefighter took a step back, his expression hardening as he looked Lauren's husband up and down. "A black man, the governor?" he scoffed, shaking his head in contempt. "Nice try, buddy. You don't fool us that easily." Lauren's husband took a steady breath, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm not here to fool you," he replied coldly. "I'm here to make sure justice is served." The men exchanged glances, their faces twisting into expressions of disdain. The lead firefighter's smirk returned as he raised his hand in a mocking salute. "Justice, huh?" he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Well, Governor, here's a little justice for you." Before either Lauren or her husband could react, one of the other firefighters grabbed the hose from the truck and aimed it directly at them. Lauren instinctively took a step back, but her husband stood his ground, his eyes locked on the man holding the hose. "Don't," he warned, his tone icy. "You're only making this worse for yourself." The firefighter hesitated for a brief moment, his hand hovering over the nozzle, but then he sneered, his face twisted with spite. "I don't take orders from you," he spat, and with a swift motion he unleashed a powerful blast of water. The force hit Lauren's husband square in the chest, driving him back. Lauren gasped, reaching out for him, but the water's relentless pressure pinned him down. She watched in horror as he struggled against the onslaught, his face contorted with pain, but still he didn't back down. He raised his arm, trying to shield himself, but the water was merciless. Another firefighter joined in, aiming a second hose at Lauren herself. She barely had time to react before the freezing water hit her with full force, knocking her off her feet. She landed hard on the pavement, gasping as the cold water drenched her once again, seeping into her skin and chilling her to the bone. The men laughed, their voices mingling with the roar of the water. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" one of them sneered, his tone filled with twisted satisfaction. Lauren tried to crawl forward, her hands scraping against the wet pavement as she attempted to reach her husband. The water continued to pummel them, each blast more punishing than the last. She could see him struggling to stand, his clothes soaked, his face etched with pain, but he didn't yield. He tried to push himself up, his hands slipping on the wet ground, but the force of the water was too much. One of the firefighters stepped closer, a sneer twisting his features. "You really thought you could just walk in here and boss us around?" he jeered. "You're nothing, understand? Nothing." Lauren's husband managed to lift his head, his gaze steady despite the agony he was enduring. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low but filled with an unshakable resolve. "You're sealing your own fate." The lead firefighter rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "Big words for someone on his knees," he taunted. "You're not in charge here. We are." With that, he motioned to his companions, who turned their hoses back on the couple, the streams of water merging into a relentless torrent that drove them back, pinning them to the ground. Lauren's vision blurred from the force, her body trembling as the icy water continued to batter her. "Stop it!" she cried, her voice barely audible over the roar. "Please, just stop." But her pleas went unheard. The men continued their assault, laughing as they watched Lauren and her husband struggle beneath the merciless spray. The humiliation was overwhelming, the sheer cruelty of their actions cutting deeper than any physical pain. Lauren fought to keep her composure, to hold on to her dignity, but the relentless punishment left her feeling utterly defeated. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the firefighters eased off, their laughter fading as they stepped back to admire their handiwork. Lauren lay on the ground, too exhausted to move, her body aching from the impact of the water. She turned her head to look at her husband, who was still lying beside her, his face pale and strained, but his eyes filled with a fierce, unbroken resolve. The lead firefighter crouched down, leaning close to her husband's face. "Let that be a lesson to you, Governor," he sneered. "You don't belong here, and if you try to pull any of this again, we'll be waiting." With one last mocking grin, the men turned and walked away, leaving Lauren and her husband lying in the street, battered and broken but not defeated. As the firefighters disappeared into the distance, Lauren felt a surge of anger rising within her, mingling with the lingering fear and humiliation. Her husband pushed himself up, his movements slow and pained, but his expression unwavering. He reached out a hand to help her up, and she took it, drawing strength from his grip. "We're going to make this right," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor of exhaustion in it. "They think they've won, but they don't know what's coming." Lauren nodded, her own determination hardening. "We won't let them get away with this," she replied, her voice filled with quiet fury. "Not after everything they've done." Together they began to walk, supporting each other as they moved away from the scene of their humiliation. Though their bodies were weakened, their spirits remained unbroken. They would seek justice, no matter how long it took, and they would ensure that those responsible for this cruel act were held accountable. As they disappeared into the night, a few passers-by gathered, their faces etched with shock and sympathy. Some took out their phones, recording the aftermath, capturing the battered couple as they moved away with a quiet dignity that spoke louder than any words. Unbeknownst to Lauren and her husband, these recordings would soon circulate, igniting a firestorm of outrage and setting in motion the events that would lead to justice. But for now, they walked in silence, their hearts filled with a shared resolve to stand up, to fight, and to demand the justice they deserved. This was far from over. Lauren and her husband continued down the street, each step slower than the last. They could feel the weight of exhaustion settling over them, but the fire of determination burned stronger than ever. They refused to let the cruelty they had endured define them. Instead, it had become a call to action, a push to see justice served. As they reached a busier area, they noticed that people were starting to gather around, their faces filled with a mixture of shock and curiosity. Lauren felt a flicker of discomfort under their gaze, but held her head high, determined not to show any sign of weakness. Among the onlookers, a young man with a phone in his hand approached cautiously, his expression filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice tentative. I saw what happened from down the street. I recorded some of it. Those men, they went way too far." Lauren exchanged a glance with her husband, feeling a surge of relief mixed with gratitude. The man had witnessed everything. His footage could be the evidence they needed to hold the firefighters accountable. "Thank you," her husband replied, his voice steady. "That recording might be the key to making sure they face justice for this." The young man nodded, holding out his phone. "I already called the police," he said, glancing around as though expecting them to arrive at any moment. "Someone needs to hear about this. What they did, it's not right." The crowd around them grew, people murmuring to each other, some taking photos, others recording videos. The images of Lauren and her husband, drenched and battered, quickly drew attention, and voices began to rise in outrage. People were appalled at the sight, and Lauren could feel a shift in the atmosphere as more and more people started to voice their support. Within minutes, the wail of police sirens broke through the murmuring crowd. Lauren felt a chill run down her spine as the squad cars approached, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. She felt her husband's hand tighten around hers, a steady reminder of his presence and strength. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, their faces unreadable as they took in the sight before them. One of them, a senior officer with a stern expression, approached the couple, eyeing the young man with the phone. "Can someone tell me what happened here?" he asked, his tone both cautious and authoritative. The young man didn't hesitate. "These two were attacked by a group of firefighters," he said, holding up his phone. "I recorded it. They were using hoses on them, laughing. It was horrible. They didn't do anything to deserve it." The officer glanced at the phone, then at Lauren and her husband, his gaze softening as he took in their disheveled and soaked appearance. "Is this true?" he asked, looking directly at Lauren's husband. "Yes," her husband replied, his voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in his eyes. "We were simply walking, minding our own business. They harassed us, attacked us with hoses, and wouldn't let us go. This was nothing short of an assault." The officer's expression hardened, his jaw clenching as he nodded. "All right. We'll need statements from both of you, and we'll also need to review that video footage," he said, motioning to the young man. "If you're willing to share it, that could be invaluable evidence." The young man nodded without hesitation. "Of course," he said. "I'll send it to you right now." The officer directed them to sit on a nearby bench while they processed the information. Lauren and her husband took a seat, grateful for a moment to catch their breath. The officers moved efficiently, taking statements, checking the video, and gathering as much information as they could. Lauren watched as they worked, feeling a sense of reassurance. This time, she and her husband were being heard. As the officers finished their initial investigation, the senior officer returned to them. "We've identified the firefighters involved," he informed them. "This is a serious offense, and rest assured, they will be held accountable for their actions. We're going to take them in for questioning immediately." Lauren felt a surge of relief, the weight on her shoulders easing ever so slightly. Finally, there was a glimmer of justice, a promise that those men wouldn't walk away from what they had done without consequences. "Thank you," her husband said, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "We appreciate everything you're doing to make sure this is handled properly." The officer nodded, a hint of respect in his gaze. "This kind of behavior is unacceptable, no matter who you are," he said. "We're here to protect, not to enable cruelty." The officer turned away, speaking briefly to his team before heading back to his squad car. The remaining officers stayed to ensure Lauren and her husband had everything they needed, offering medical assistance and additional statements if they required it. Lauren felt a growing sense of hope. The presence of the police, their willingness to listen and take action, was a reminder that there were still people who believed in justice. As they were escorted to a nearby medical tent set up by paramedics, Lauren's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. She knew that the road to full justice would not be easy. There would likely be investigations, interviews, and public scrutiny. But she was ready. This experience had only strengthened her resolve to fight, not only for herself and her husband, but for anyone who had been silenced, anyone who had been wronged. As they sat together, waiting for the medical team to assess their injuries, Lauren took her husband's hand in hers. She could feel his exhaustion, but also his determination, the same fire that burned within her. "We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," she said, her voice a whisper but filled with conviction. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "We'll make sure they remember this night for a long time." Lauren knew that the coming days would be filled with challenges, but for the first time since the attack, she felt a sense of peace. The path to justice had begun, and they wouldn't stop until they saw it through. As the police began to secure the scene, she glanced around at the people who still stood nearby, some watching, some recording. She realized that they had allies in this fight, people who believed in fairness and decency. And in that moment, she knew that they were not alone. News of the attack on Lauren and her husband spread rapidly. Within hours, photos and videos captured by bystanders began circulating online, sparking a wave of outrage that swept through the city. The images showed Lauren and her husband drenched and battered, their clothes clinging to them as they were surrounded by jeering firefighters. The shock and indignation were palpable, and soon, public outcry filled every corner of social media. Lauren and her husband had known that this incident would gain some attention, but they hadn't anticipated the scale. Their story resonated with people across the city and beyond, drawing comments and support from individuals who saw in their struggle a reflection of their own experiences. People were sharing their own stories of harassment, recounting moments when those in positions of power had used their authority as a weapon rather than a shield. The day after the incident, the local news channels picked up the story, their headlines carrying the weight of the injustice that had been committed. "Governor and wife assaulted by firefighters," read one headline. Another station framed it as a call for change. "Abuse of power. Firefighters attack couple in shocking display of cruelty." Every angle of the story focused on the blatant misuse of authority, and the public demanded accountability. Lauren and her husband spent the morning in the hospital, where doctors conducted thorough examinations to ensure they hadn't sustained any lasting injuries. Lauren had bruises along her arms and legs from being knocked down repeatedly by the water's force, and her husband's back was sore from the repeated blasts. Despite the physical pain, their spirits were undeterred, strengthened by the messages of support pouring in from friends, family, and even strangers. By afternoon, the governor's office was inundated with calls from journalists requesting statements, and several prominent civil rights organizations reached out, offering their support and resources. Lauren and her husband knew that this was an opportunity to speak out, to bring attention to a deeper issue within their community, the unchecked power that some individuals wielded over others. The governor's office scheduled a press conference, setting it for the next morning. Lauren's husband, despite his position, had always been a private person, but now he knew he had to step forward and speak not just as a governor, but as a man who had been wronged. He spent hours preparing his words, carefully crafting a statement that would reflect not only the pain they had endured, but also the resilience they felt in standing up against it. The next day, the press conference took place on the steps of the governor's office. Lauren stood beside her husband, her hand in his, their unity a visible reminder of their strength in the face of adversity. Reporters and photographers gathered, microphones ready as they waited for his statement. Clearing his throat, Lauren's husband stepped up to the podium, his gaze steady as he looked out over the crowd. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying a calm authority that silenced the murmuring. "Yesterday, my wife and I were subjected to an act of cruelty that no person should ever have to endure. We were harassed, humiliated, and attacked by individuals who chose to abuse the power entrusted to them." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd, the weight of his words settling heavily over the assembled reporters. Lauren stood beside him, her face resolute, her heart swelling with pride as she listened to him speak. "This was not just an attack on us as individuals," he continued. "It was an attack on the values we hold dear: dignity, respect, and equality. When those in positions of authority misuse their power, they betray the trust of the people they serve." The crowd hung on his every word, their attention unwavering. Lauren's husband paused, letting the silence emphasize his message before he continued. "We demand justice," he declared, his tone unwavering. "We demand accountability, not just for what happened to us, but for every person who has ever suffered at the hands of those who believe themselves to be above the law. This is not simply about punishment. It's about change, about ensuring that this kind of abuse is never repeated." He looked out over the crowd, his gaze fierce, filled with determination. "We will not rest until we see real reforms in the institutions that failed us. We will work with every willing ally, every community member who believes in justice, to create a future where people can walk through their own neighborhoods without fear." Lauren squeezed his hand, feeling the intensity of his words, the raw truth that filled every syllable. She knew that he spoke not only for them, but for countless others who had endured similar acts of cruelty and abuse. As he finished, the crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the open space. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping as they tried to get his attention, but he stepped back, nodding at them with a silent assurance that more would come. For now, they had said what needed to be said. In the hours following the press conference, Lauren and her husband felt the weight of the city's support. Messages flooded in from allies and advocates, from community members who pledged their solidarity. Some city officials reached out, offering to assist in the reform efforts they had called for, while civil rights organizations began to organize marches and rallies, drawing attention to the urgent need for change within the fire department and beyond. But the support didn't end there. On social media, people shared clips of the press conference, commending the governor and his wife for their courage. The video, recorded by the young man during the attack, continued to circulate, viewed by millions who were horrified by the brazen display of power. Public outrage grew, intensifying as more people saw the footage, and calls for action echoed across every platform. The firefighters involved were quickly suspended pending investigation, and a committee was established to review the policies and conduct of the fire department. The pressure from the community, combined with the clear evidence of the video, left little room for those in power to ignore the situation. Lauren watched these developments with a mixture of relief and determination. She knew that the road ahead was long, that true change would require more than just words or temporary suspensions. She and her husband would need to push for lasting reforms, to work alongside those who shared their vision of a fairer, more just society. As night fell, she and her husband finally allowed themselves a moment of rest. They sat together in their living room holding hands as they reflected on everything that had happened, on the journey that still lay before them. The pain and humiliation they had endured were still fresh, but so was the strength they had drawn from each other, from the community that stood with them. "We're not alone in this," Lauren said softly, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "There are so many people out there who want the same things we do. We can make a difference." Her husband nodded, his expression solemn. "Yes, and we will. This is only the beginning." As they sat together, the city continued to buzz with the call for justice. The outcry showed no signs of fading, and Lauren knew that they had ignited a spark that could not easily be extinguished. They had turned their pain into purpose, and, with the support of those around them, they were ready to see this fight through to the end. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind of action and reform. The public's demand for justice had grown to a fervor, with people taken to the streets in protest, marching with signs and chanting for accountability. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens rallied together, their voices rising in unison, calling for the firefighters involved to face the full weight of the law. This was more than an isolated incident. It was a symbol of something much larger: the abuse of power, unchecked prejudice, and the urgent need for systemic change. Lauren and her husband watched as the story continued to make headlines, each new article and news segment another testament to the impact their story had on the public. The footage of the attack, combined with the governor's powerful speech, had struck a chord, prompting widespread support that they hadn't fully anticipated. People from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own experiences, their own stories of injustice, and thanking the couple for their courage. The legal proceedings against the firefighters were swift. The video evidence, coupled with witness statements and the governor's own testimony, left little room for doubt. The firefighters were formally charged with assault and abuse of authority, and they faced disciplinary actions within the fire department. One by one, they were called to answer for their actions in court, their faces no longer filled with smug arrogance, but with the dawning realization of the consequences they would now face. Lauren and her husband attended every hearing, their presence a silent reminder of their commitment to justice. The firefighters' attempts to minimize their actions were quickly dismissed by the prosecution, which presented the video as irrefutable evidence of their cruelty. In the end, the firefighters were convicted, their sentences reflecting the severity of their abuse and the harm they had inflicted. But for Lauren and her husband, justice went beyond individual punishment. They wanted to ensure that the fire department and other institutions like it could no longer shield those who use their positions to harm others. They worked closely with city officials to introduce new policies and reforms, starting with mandatory sensitivity training for all firefighters, along with stricter regulations on the use of force in any situation involving civilians. The reforms extended beyond the fire department, as other public service institutions began to adopt similar policies, inspired by the governor's call for accountability and transparency. Lauren's husband continued to use his platform to advocate for change, organizing forums and town hall meetings where people could voice their concerns, share their experiences, and participate in shaping the future of their community. The support from the community was overwhelming. People came forward to volunteer, offering their time, skills, and resources to help build a safer, more equitable environment. Organizations dedicated to social justice joined the cause, creating coalitions that worked tirelessly to ensure that these reforms would become a lasting part of the city's policies. Through it all, Lauren remained at her husband's side, her quiet strength a constant source of support. She continued to speak out, sharing her experience, her voice unwavering as she urged others to stand against injustice in all its forms. Her resilience became an inspiration to many, and people looked up to her not only as the governor's wife, but as a leader in her own right. As the months went by, the changes they had fought for began to take root. The fire department, once resistant to oversight, transformed under the new policies, shedding the culture of impunity that had allowed the abuse to occur. New leadership emerged, committed to fostering a culture of respect, fairness, and accountability. Lauren and her husband continued to monitor the progress, working with community leaders and officials to ensure that the reforms remained in place. One evening, as Lauren and her husband walked through their neighborhood, they noticed a small group gathered in the park discussing recent changes in the community. They listened as people expressed gratitude for the steps taken, sharing stories of how the new policies had made a difference in their lives. Some spoke of feeling safer, others of a renewed trust in the institutions that served them. Lauren felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she listened. The fight had been long, the journey difficult, but they had made a real impact. They had turned a moment of pain into a movement for justice, inspiring change that would benefit generations to come. Her husband took her hand, his gaze filled with quiet pride. "We did it," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. Lauren smiled, feeling a profound sense of peace. "Yes," she replied, "and we'll keep doing it. This is only the beginning." They stood there together, watching as the city they loved began to heal. A place where justice was no longer just a word, but a promise they had helped fulfill. After everything they endured, Lauren and her husband's courage has sparked a powerful message. This story is a reminder that standing up for what's right can make a difference. If you were moved by their journey, be sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.